The fog that settles over the low hills of western Kentucky in late autumn has a way of softening everything it touches, turning gravel shoulders into ghost gray ribbons and churchyard maples into muted silhouettes that sway without sound, as if holding their breath with the rest of the county. On a Saturday morning in 1974, before the sun had fully burned away that veil, and before anyone could suspect the day would be different from 100 others that came before it, 16-year-old Anna Mae Collins stepped out of her family's clapboard house with a list tucked into her jacket pocket and the untroubled rhythm of a routine that had never given cause for caution, the kind of ordinary errand that anchors a small town to itself, the kind where sidewalks remember the tread of familiar shoes. The bell over the market door would ring once, then again, the pair of soft chimes that the owner refused to replace because it sounded like memory itself. And a voice behind the counter would ask about her parents, about the weather, about the promised cold front that might arrive with a hiss and an inch of frost. It takes almost no time at all for a life to pass through a threshold and out into a morning that looks like every other morning. But the minutes that followed would stretch across 5 decades and shadow miles of gravel. And those who loved Anna Mae would learn how long a single hour can become when it goes missing. Later, there would be photographs laid out on a kitchen table, and the quiet confession that nobody locks their doors around here, because the fields feel like a safety net, because the creek behind the school has always been full of minnows, and the county fair always ends with fireworks reflected in the reservoir, because the worst stories belonged somewhere else, on the far side of a radio broadcast or tucked beneath out-of-town headlines. But in the first minutes of that morning, none of that existed. Only the light clinking of a paper sack against a wristwatch, the scrape of gravel, the angled slice of white steeple against a cloud bank moving east, and a promise to be back before lunch. This is where we begin, with a routine that felt like a prayer answered and ended like a question that refused to be quiet, because beneath that fog, a cold case took root, and it would grow quietly for nearly 50 years until science and stubborn hearts pulled it from the soil. And a doorbell would ring in a different season to signal an arrest that seemed to arrive from another lifetime, though it had always lived next door. In a county where mailboxes lean toward the road like elderly men waiting for company, people notice who passes, and when. They count by instinct the headlights that curve past the feed store, the silhouette that pauses at the crosswalk, and the dog that follows 2 paces behind. Anna Mae's morning list included coffee, twine, a jar of preserves, and the small things that stitch a kitchen back together, and the path home traced the same 2-lane stretch that ran flat along corn stubble and fence posts, patterned with bird droppings and frost. The last person to speak with her would later remember laughter, the kind that lifts, at the end like a promise, and the way the fog beaded on her eyelashes, a constellation of dew that made blinking feel like wiping a window. And then a wave, a step down to the road, her figure shrinking into a blur that could be anyone. And then just the idea of a person moving away, time-stamped the receipt with a clean inked number that would become a point on a map, the hinge that investigators would return to again and again because it would not move no matter how many years bent around it. 20 minutes should have delivered a door creaking open, and footsteps on kitchen tile, and a voice calling into the back room. But 20 minutes, like certain prayers, sometimes failed to arrive, and silence sits at a table where steam curls off a mug until it cools, until the surface returns an empty sky. In a place where the loudest night sound is the lowing of cattle or the distant whistle of a freight dragging its tail across the county line, fear arrives quietly, like a storm that forgets lightning. A car goes out, circles, returns, goes out again, runs the same loop more quickly, and the number of rings at the sheriff's office seems both too many and not enough, because the person on the other end has said these words before and hopes not to say them again. Searchers gather without needing to be asked. Boots pulling at the ditch mud. Flashlights opening cones of pale yellow inside the remaining fog. And dogs lifting their noses to a story they can scent but cannot read aloud. The road edge yields a button. A grocery slip. A jar confused with stones in the ditch water. And tire impressions that belong to half the county, because everyone buys the same brand when the ice comes. The sheriff's department keeps an evidence kit in a metal cabinet that sticks in humidity, a Polaroid camera that refuses to flash consistently, fingerprint powder that clumps, and a scale that lists left no matter how it's leveled. They do what they can do, and it would be unfair to pretend otherwise. The tape stretched, photographs snapped, a map unfurled across the hood of a car that ticks as it cools because it has been driving back and forth without rest, and someone who has not slept in 20 hours, tracing the same route with a blunt pencil, as if pressure alone could coax a new direction into being. The ordinary objects left behind that morning become talismans. Anna Mae's note in careful script, her cardigan snagged on bramble, then freed by a hand that didn't belong to its wearer. Two parallel grooves in fresh mud that rearrange themselves every time someone explains them, and the cigarette butt flicked into weeds by a driver who never even saw the girl in the road. So much of any mystery is whisper, and the early version of the story spreads like steam, retold with slight additions, lilted into opinion, shaped by the teller's fears and the listener's own reflection. By nightfall, the courthouse lights glow a soft square on the lawn, and the vending machine down the hall becomes a confessional, where searchers buy coffee they do not drink simply to hold something warm. On the table, a ledger full of questions without sums, the corner of a photograph curling upon itself, and a map pin driven into the exact location where visibility drops when the fog rides low above the creek. The person in charge says, "These things resolve," that young folks sometimes run, and that they return for quilts and cash before the second sunrise. And those words don't sound cruel so much as hopeful, a hope borrowed from decades when the worst really did seem to come from somewhere else. Still, the Collins family knows the weight of a house that has never felt so empty. The way doors become mouths swallowing air they cannot swallow fast enough, and the terrible surprise of an extra fork on a table that no longer seems big enough for grief. By the second day, the fog had lifted from the valley, but not from the minds of those who traced and retraced the gravel shoulder where Anna Mae Collins was last seen. The Collins farm sat half a mile past the curve in the road, its red barn weathered to a dull rust and its kitchen light burning steadily, as if its glow could guide her back. Her mother set the table again that morning, unable to stop herself from placing a plate where her daughters would be, the scrape of porcelain against wood echoing through the still house like a hymn half sung. Her father had driven the pickup until dawn, circling loops that led nowhere, headlights striking the same fence posts, the same mailboxes, the same patch of woods where the dogs had grown restless, and still returning empty. Grief has a way of making a house sound larger, its silence stretching into corners you never noticed before. And that silence pressed hard against the Collins family, as deputies knocked on the door and began asking questions that seemed too small for the enormity of what was happening. The sheriff, a stocky man with 30 years behind him but more experience with lost livestock than lost children, spread a county map across the hood of his cruiser. He dragged a pencil across the roads, as though lines could summon direction. Deputies were dispatched to check barns, sheds, and culverts, their radios crackling with static more often than information. A borrowed helicopter circled from Frankfurt, its blades rattling the windows of farmhouses, searchers below lifting their hands to shield eyes as they scanned the flat, unyielding fields. Bloodhounds arrived from Lexington, with their handlers, muzzles pressed to Anna Mae's cardigan, the dogs pulling hard along the roadside before faltering near the creek and circling with confusion, noses catching fragments of scent that dissipated like smoke in the autumn air. The county had no dedicated forensic unit in 1974. No lab equipped for the kind of precision the case demanded. A Polaroid camera was pressed into service, but its flashes came and went unpredictably, leaving photographs clouded and uneven. A muddy print near the ditch was partially washed by a drizzle before anyone thought to cover it. Anna Mae's books, found scattered along the gravel, were bagged in paper sacks, the careful notes in the margins catalogued, but offering no clue. To the Collins family, those schoolbooks weren't evidence. They were extensions of their daughter's mind, pages filled with her neat script, the kind she had practiced on lined paper since elementary school. Neighbors gathered, not waiting to be asked, forming search parties with lanterns and borrowed flashlights. Old men carried walking sticks. Younger ones carried shotguns, as though protection might matter. Women set up tables with coffee, sandwiches, and prayer books. The Methodist pastor offered words from the pulpit that Sunday, his voice cracking as he told the congregation that the Lord tests but does not abandon. It did little to ease the tension that had already begun to weave itself into the town's daily rhythm. By Monday morning, the Collins farmhouse had become a staging ground. Maps were taped to the walls, photographs spread across the dining room table, and the coffee pot was never empty. Reporters from Louisville arrived, their cameras flashing on the front porch, their questions sharp-edged. Did Anna Mae have a boyfriend? Did she have reason to run? Was there trouble at home? The Collins family endured those questions with quiet disbelief, their grief compounded by insinuations that sought to explain the inexplicable. Detective Harold Warren was assigned from the state police, his first major case after years spent chasing stolen tractors and liquor violations. He was younger than the sheriff and more meticulous, keeping a notebook filled with precise lines of observation. He interviewed Morrison, the grocer, 3 times in the span of a week, each time asking the same questions in different orders, looking for inconsistencies that never appeared. Morrison's account remained solid. Anna Mae had helped him close, smiled as she left, and waved through the fog. Nothing more, nothing less. The search expanded outward. Drainage ditches were drained, culverts probed with long poles, and abandoned barns swept with lanterns. Divers combed shallow ponds where cattails rattled in the wind. At the county line, farmers paused their tractors to let deputies inspect their outbuildings, but nothing turned up, not so much as a ribbon, a shoe, or a strand of hair. Each day without answers thickened the air in the Collins farmhouse until it was hard to breathe. Chester, the family's border collie, waited by the door at 6:15 every evening, whining softly, nose pressed to the crack, listening for footsteps that never came. By November, with the frost biting at the fields and the nights stretching long, the official search scaled back. The sheriff admitted quietly to the Collins family that leads had dried up. He promised to keep men on the roads, to follow every tip, but the weight of futility sat heavy in his voice. For the Collinses, life had split into a before and an after, each day measured by absence. Margaret Collins began keeping a folder, filling it with newspaper clippings, handwritten notes from tips that trickled in, and photographs of Anna Mae smiling, as though archiving the life she refused to let vanish into silence. Detective Warren drove the route at odd hours, headlights cutting through fog and frost, replaying the walk in his mind. He stopped at fence posts, barns, and creek crossings, kneeling to study the ground as though the earth might confess. He asked the same questions again and again to truck drivers, to farmhands, and to storekeepers, building a notebook thick with words but thin with answers. Each page became a measure of frustration, a record of how time erases more than it reveals. By winter's end, the Collins case had become the county's quiet wound. Search parties dwindled, tips grew stale, and the sheriff's office moved on to more immediate concerns. But in the farmhouse on County Road 17, Margaret Collins kept her vigil. She folded Anna Mae's clothes, dusted the ceramic horses on her dresser, and left the bedspread smooth and untouched, waiting for the day her daughter might return. By the spring of 1975, the case of Anna Mae Collins had already begun to gather dust in ways that terrified her mother more than any prowler ever could. Officially, the sheriff's office labeled it open and ongoing. Unofficially, it sat in a metal filing cabinet in the basement of the courthouse, a thin folder wedged between livestock theft reports and routine burglary files. Each page was neat, each signature precise, but together they formed a hollow record of a girl who had walked into fog and never returned. For Margaret Collins, that emptiness was intolerable. She carried the case herself in ways only a mother could. She typed letters on her husband's old Underwood, addressed to newspapers in Louisville, Frankfort, and even Cincinnati, pleading for continued coverage. She called radio stations and appeared on local talk segments, her voice steady but haunted, insisting her daughter's name be spoken aloud so it would not fade. Detective Harold Warren, still young enough to bristle at the quiet surrender of bureaucracy, kept his own vigil. His notebook was filled with tips from psychics, from men who swore they'd seen a girl hitchhiking in Tennessee, and from women certain they'd spotted Anna Mae in a mall in St. Louis. Each claim collapsed under scrutiny. Still, Warren drove thousands of miles chasing shadows because he could not bear to tell the Collins family he had nothing. His colleagues ribbed him for his obsession, but in the silence of his small office, he taped Anna Mae's school photo to the wall. He told himself he'd leave it there until the case was solved. The late 70s brought a rhythm of false hope. A wallet was found in a ditch near Bowling Green, a shoe by a riverbank in Indiana, a young woman's body in Ohio that bore a faint resemblance. Each discovery jolted the Collins family, forcing them to brace themselves for the phone calls, the trips to morgues, and the careful explanations that followed. Each time, relief and devastation intertwined. Relief that the remains weren't Anna Mae, devastation that the mystery persisted. The Collins farm bore the weight of these cycles. Margaret grew thinner, her auburn hair streaked gray well before its time. Thomas, her husband, worked longer hours in the fields, his silence deeper, his back bent not just by labor, but by absence. Chester, the border collie, aged visibly, still waiting by the door each evening at 6:15, ears pricked for steps that never came. By the 80s, the case had entered folklore. Teenagers driving at night dared each other to walk the stretch of County Road 17, where Anna Mae's books had been found. Some swore they heard whispers in the fog. Others claimed to see a figure in a pale cardigan vanishing into the trees. Parents used her name as a cautionary tale. Don't linger after dark. Don't walk alone. Don't trust every smile. In town, the general store kept a photograph of Anna Mae taped near the register, its edges curling with years. Mr. Morrison, who had last seen her that morning, dusted the frame weakly, his eyes moistening each time he straightened it. He never forgave himself for letting her walk out the door without insisting on driving her home. Margaret's folder became a cabinet, then a small room. She stored every article, every letter, and every theory she encountered. She began attending support groups in Grand Rapids, where other parents shared their stories of vanished children. She would drive home late at night, headlights sweeping empty roads, her mind locked on the possibility that Anna Mae was still somewhere, waiting for someone not to give up. She refused to speak of her daughter in the past tense, even as years folded into decades. Detective Warren rose through the ranks, promoted to sergeant. He carried Anna Mae's file with him from office to office, reviewing it whenever new forensic techniques made headlines. In the early 80s, fiber analysis became more sophisticated. He resubmitted the cardigan, the books, and the scraps of fabric to the state lab. Nothing conclusive emerged. In the 90s, DNA entered the lexicon of law enforcement. He thought again of the muddy footprint, the cigarette butt, and the cardigan snagged on bramble. But those items had been compromised, lost, or too degraded for early tests. The weight of missed opportunity gnawed at him, especially in the quiet hours when his own children slept down the hall. He wondered what it meant to dedicate a life to questions without answers. Meanwhile, the Collins farm endured. The barn roof sagged under years of storms, fields grew less productive, and the family leaned heavily on neighbors for help. Thomas grew gaunt, his once powerful frame shrinking. In 1989, he collapsed in the north pasture, his heart finally giving way. Margaret buried him in the family plot, the headstone carved with simple words, "A devoted husband and father who never stopped searching." At the funeral, Warren stood beside her, his uniform pressed, his cap tucked under his arm. He promised her again, quietly, that he would not stop looking. Margaret only nodded. Words had grown too thin to hold her grief. Through the 90s, the world modernized. Cable television brought true crime documentaries into living rooms. National databases began linking cases across state lines. Margaret watched each program with fierce attention, scribbling notes, calling tip lines, and mailing photographs of Anna Mae's smiling face. She became both archivist and advocate. Her life narrowed to a single mission. Neighbors admired her persistence, but whispered about the toll. She had become a fixture at the sheriff's office, a woman in her 60s sitting rigid in waiting rooms, clutching a binder, her eyes sharp, her questions sharper. Deputies came and went, new sheriffs were elected, but Margaret remained constant, a reminder of unfinished business. By the turn of the millennium, Anna Mae's case had been transferred to the cold case shelf officially. Warren retired in 2001, his hair silver, his hands arthritic from years of scribbling notes. Before leaving, he placed the Collins file in a banker's box, sealed it, and wrote in neat block letters, "Do not discard. Await science." He handed Margaret a copy of the inventory, telling her, "One day, the evidence will speak louder than silence." She held his gaze, her eyes damp but unwavering. The county carried on, but Anna Mae's name never disappeared entirely. It surfaced in sermons, in school hallways, and in the stories parents told their children when they warned them to be careful. It hovered at the edges of fairs and town meetings, an absence that had become part of identity. The gravel road where her books had been found grew cracked and overgrown in places, but every September, flowers appeared at the site, laid by unknown hands. The ghost of that morning remained, waiting for a voice to break the silence. The earth does not forget. In March of 2019, a backhoe operator clearing ground for a new subdivision on the outskirts of Laurel County struck something that resisted the blade. At first, the man thought it was an old fence post or discarded farm equipment, common enough in fields that had been worked for generations. But when he climbed down and brushed the soil aside with his gloved hands, he saw fabric. It was pale blue, discolored by decades underground, but unmistakably cloth. Nearby, a sliver of bone protruded from the clay. He froze, the hum of his idling machine suddenly deafening. A call was made. Within an hour, sheriff's deputies had cordoned off the site with yellow tape that fluttered in the spring wind, drawing curious neighbors to the roadside. Detective Maria Santos was among the first to arrive. A veteran of cold case work, she had joined the county force after years with the state police, bringing a reputation for persistence and forensic savvy tenacity. She crouched in the churned mud, her eyes fixed on the fragment of fabric. Something about its weave, the stubborn threads clinging to decades of soil, carried a weight that felt familiar. When she heard the operator describe exactly where his blade had caught, 100 yards from the bend in County Road 17, her stomach clenched. That was where the books had been found in 1974. By the next morning, a team of forensic anthropologists from the University of Kentucky was on site. They erected a tent against the rain, brought in screens to sift soil, and treated the scene like a delicate archaeological dig. Each layer of clay was peeled back in inches. Each fragment was photographed before removal. On the second day, The partial skeleton of a young female began to emerge. The bones were remarkably intact, preserved by the alkaline soil and depth of burial. There were signs of deliberate placement. The body lay on its side, knees drawn slightly upward, arms close to the torso. It was not a casual disposal. It was a burial, and it had been meant to remain hidden. Among the remains were the tattered shreds of a cardigan, the faded buttons still clinging to the placket. In the soil nearby lay a silver bracelet, bent but intact, engraved faintly with initials. The anthropologist, Dr. Emily Chen, held it up with gloved fingers, the inscription dulled but legible under the dust. A.M. C.A. Murmur ran through the small crowd of investigators. They all knew whose initials those were. News traveled fast in a county where silence itself carried weight. By the third day, Margaret Collins stood at the edge of the excavation, her body frail but her posture rigid, gripping a cane in one hand and a folded photograph in the other. Detective Santos approached gently, explaining that the remains were undergoing examination and that nothing could be confirmed yet. Margaret listened without interruption, then opened her hand to reveal the photo. Anna Mae, 16, auburn hair pulled back, cardigan buttoned against autumn chill. The image mirrored the shreds emerging from the ground. Margaret nodded once, as if some part of her had always known this day would come. Within a week, the remains were transported to the state crime lab. Forensic odontologist Dr. Robert Wagner compared dental records preserved from Anna Mae's childhood dentist to the recovered skull. The match was conclusive: 3 distinct fillings and 1 slightly misaligned incisor. After 45 years, the Collins family finally had confirmation. Anna Mae had come home, not alive, but no longer lost to nameless soil. Yet confirmation was not closure. The bones carried their own story, and it was grim. The hyoid bone, fragile and horseshoe-shaped, bore fractures consistent with strangulation. There were micro-scratches on the ribs and clavicle, signs of a struggle. Under Anna Mae's fingernails, remarkably preserved in the dry clay, forensic technicians extracted tiny flecks of skin and cellular material. Santos watched the evidence bags being sealed with a sense of awe and dread. This was the moment Sergeant Warren had prophesied decades earlier, that science would one day speak louder than silence. The lab's DNA analysis took weeks, but by April 2019, the results were in. Beneath Anna Mae's nails was a male genetic profile, strong, clear, and complete enough to upload to CODIS, the national database. Santos clicked submit with tempered expectations. Cold cases often yielded nothing but the cruel reminder of progress denied. But within hours, the system pinged back a notification that made her breath catch. A familial match had been found, not to a known offender, but to someone who had submitted their DNA for genealogy. The trail led to a second cousin in Ohio, a man in his 30s with no criminal history. Genealogical mapping expanded the tree outward, tracing branches backward through birth records, marriage certificates, and obituaries. It took 2 months of painstaking work by genealogist Patricia Lombardi, a retired librarian turned forensic researcher, to narrow the family down to one line that had lived in Laurel County in the 70s. At the center of that line was a name that stunned Santos, a man revered in the community for decades. A man who had stood beside the Collins family during the original searches, who had organized volunteers and comforted Margaret when her voice broke. The DNA pointed to Robert Hale, now 78, once the county's volunteer fire chief, the same man whose photograph in local newspapers showed him holding a lantern during the 1974 search for Anna Mae. He had been part of the effort to find her. He had led prayers at vigils, and all the while, evidence now suggested, he had been the reason she never came home. The irony was devastating. The betrayal was almost unbearable. But for the first time in nearly half a century, the case had a name tethered to evidence. Science had spoken, and the ground had given up its secret. The question now was whether justice could still be carried out, decades after the night Anna Mae Collins vanished into the Kentucky fog. Detective Santos knew that evidence alone was not enough to walk into a courtroom with a 45-year-old murder. DNA could open the door, but the case needed corroboration patterns, witnesses, and physical proof that would bind Robert Hale to Anna Mae's final moments. She began where Warren had left off decades earlier, the old case file, brittle pages that smelled of mildew and regret. Every interview was reread, every timeline reconstructed. What emerged was less a neat sequence of events than a constellation of overlooked details that now glowed with new relevance. Hale had been 33 in 1974, already respected as the volunteer fire chief, a man called upon for barn fires, tractor accidents, and community emergencies. His authority placed him everywhere without question. He knew the backroads intimately and could move unnoticed in the dark, under the guise of duty. In Warren's original notes, Hale's name appeared only briefly. He had helped coordinate volunteers during the search, reported nothing unusual, and offered condolences. That was it. No one had asked where he was at 6:30 p.m. on September 23rd, the window when Anna Mae disappeared. No one had thought to. Santos requested Hale's fire department logs from that year. Most were handwritten, curling pages bound in ledger books. On the night of September 23rd, the entry read simply, "Routine equipment check, 1,900 hours. No signatures, no corroboration, a vague note that could place him anywhere." Cross-referencing with dispatch records showed no calls that night. In hindsight, it was the perfect alibi. Invisible, unsupervised, and cloaked in the trust of service. Community memory was harder to parse. Many who had walked the search fields with Hale were now gone, but a few remained. Santos interviewed them carefully, sometimes in nursing homes, sometimes at kitchen tables, lined with pill bottles and family photos. One man remembered Hale showing up unusually late on the first night of the search, his boots muddy above the ankles, his flashlight low on batteries. Another recalled that Hale insisted on leading a small group toward the woods near County Road 17, where Anna Mae's books had been found. He claimed he knew the terrain better than most. At the time, it seemed like dedication. Now, in the light of DNA, it reeked of familiarity with the crime scene. Santos also tracked down photographs from the 1,974 search. Local papers had printed black and white images of volunteers fanning through fields. In two, Hale appeared at the edge of the frame, stooped, lantern in hand, his expression grim. On closer inspection, Santos noticed something else. A dark smear on his cardigan sleeve. Indistinct in newsprint, but present nonetheless. In 1974, it was meaningless. In 2019, it suggested the possibility of blood or soil from the site where Anna Mae's body would later be unearthed. The investigation widened into Hale's past. Neighbors recalled his helpfulness and his presence at every barn raising and funeral. But there were shadows. In 1972, a high school girl reported being followed by a truck that matched his. The complaint never advanced. The sheriff at the time dismissed it as misidentification. In 1976, a farmhand remembered Hale appearing suddenly on a back road, offering her a ride she declined. She thought nothing of it until Santos asked decades later if she remembered his tone. Insistent, almost rehearsed, she said. Hale's home, a modest ranch on the edge of town, became the focus of a search warrant. Deputies combed through attics and garages, pulling down boxes untouched for years. Among the firefighting gear and family albums lay a shoebox filled with small items. A silver beret, a yellowed movie ticket, and a cheap plastic bracelet. Trophies, Santos thought, each carefully chosen, each belonging to someone who had never realized they'd been marked. At the bottom was a faded, creased photo of Anna Mae at a church picnic, her head turned mid-laugh, her cardigan pale against the dark grass. No one in her family remembered giving Hale the picture. When confronted with the DNA evidence, Hale's attorney dismissed it as circumstantial, a relic of contamination, but the prosecution team knew differently. Hale had lived a double life, one built on service and trust, the other hidden in shadows. For decades he had sat in pews, organized food drives, and shaken hands with parents whose children he had endangered. His mask had been nearly perfect. Nearly. The community's reaction was disbelief, bordering on revolt. Older residents who had relied on Hale for safety bristled at the accusation. At the diner, conversations turned heated, voices rising as some refused to believe a man who had saved lives from fires could have taken a young girl's. But others remembered the unease of the way he lingered near teenagers, his late-night patrols with no clear purpose, and his insistence on inserting himself into every crisis. The town split between those who clung to the myth of Hale the protector and those who began to see him as Hale the predator, hidden in plain sight. Margaret Collins sat through it all with an expression that revealed little. When reporters asked her reaction to Hale's name being linked to her daughter, she spoke only one sentence: "The ground tells no lies." Her words echoed through news reports, sharp as scripture. As the county confronted the possibility that their trusted fire chief had carried the weight of murder in silence for nearly 50 years, the indictment was filed in late summer. Hale, frail but still upright, was led from his front porch in handcuffs as neighbors watched from across the street. Some wept, some shook their heads. One woman whispered, "I let him fix my fence last year." The image of him in an orange jumpsuit at arraignment severed the last strands of denial. The betrayal was not just of a family, but of an entire community that had allowed him to walk among them, cloaked in respect. And yet, for the investigators, the work was far from over. DNA had identified him, artifacts had supported the theory, and community whispers had filled gaps. But what they needed now was the story, the why, the how, and the confirmation that would carry weight in a courtroom. The truth lay somewhere between the artifacts in his house, the fractures on Anna Mae's bones, and the words Hale himself might be persuaded to speak. The interrogation room was built for short confessions, not for unraveling half a century of deception. Its walls were bare, the fluorescent light unforgiving, and the tables scarred with grooves from years of suspects carving their initials or running restless fingernails across its surface. Robert Hale sat in the metal chair like a man at a town meeting, hands folded calmly, posture steady. He was 78 now, but his presence still carried the authority of someone used to being deferred to. He looked at Detective Santos with the measured eyes of a man who had rehearsed for this moment in silence for decades. Santos began carefully. She laid the folder on the table and slid a photograph across to him. Anna Mae's face, frozen forever at 16, smiling at something unseen. Hale's jaw flexed, a muscle twitching near his temple, but otherwise his expression did not change. She spoke of the excavation, of the bracelet unearthed with the initials engraved, and of the DNA beneath Anna Mae's fingernails. She described the meticulous preservation of evidence, how science had advanced, and how the ground itself had carried the truth forward through time. Hale listened without interruption. When she paused, he finally spoke. His voice was steady, almost courteous. "You people don't know what you think you know. Dirt plays tricks. Samples get mixed." He leaned back slightly, with the calm of someone accustomed to being believed. For decades, his uniform and title had shielded him. He reached for that shield again. Santos pressed further. She slid another photograph across the table. The shoebox of trinkets found in his attic, the barrette, the ticket stub, and the picnic photograph of Anna Mae. "Explain these," she said. Hale's fingers tightened slightly against each other. His eyes lowered, then flicked up again. "I kept things," he murmured. "People keep things. Doesn't make them guilty." But cracks had begun to show. The measured tone faltered when she mentioned his fire logs, the vague entries about equipment checks, and the late arrival at the search fields with mud caked to his boots. She described the cardigan sleeve, captured in grainy black and white photographs, the smear no one had noticed in 1974. Hale's lips tightened into a line. He tapped his fingers once, twice, against the table. Hours stretched. Silence became as heavy as words. Santos let it linger, the weight pressing against him. Finally he spoke again, softer this time. She fought. His eyes shifted away from hers, staring instead at the fluorescent light. Scratched me up good. The words hung in the room like smoke. It wasn't a confession yet, but it was an admission that only one person could make. The man whose skin had been trapped beneath her fingernails, preserved until science could give it a voice. From there, the unraveling was slow, halting, but inexorable. He described passing her on the road, stopping his truck, and offering a ride. He told himself he was only concerned for her safety, fog thickening, night closing in. But as she climbed in, something shifted. She laughed at me, he said, though the details blurred. Or maybe she just smiled. I can't remember. He tightened his grip on the table edge. I wanted her to stop looking at me like that. The account grew darker, clinical in its detail. He admitted driving her off the road, toward the wooded patch near County Road 17. He spoke of losing control, of strangling her in the sudden frenzy of the moment. But when Santos pressed on motive, he withdrew. His words became vague, couched in justifications. Stress, loneliness, and the weight of responsibility as fire chief. The excuses rang hollow. What emerged clearly, however, was premeditation after the act. He described wrapping her body, carrying it under the cover of night, and burying her in clay soil, far enough from the road to avoid discovery. He even acknowledged returning in the days after, pretending to search near the very place he had left her, lantern in hand, his presence a mask of grief and duty. I thought it would be over, he said, his voice flat. But it never was. Investigators listened, recording every word, corroborating each detail against the evidence from the site. The fractured hyoid, the cardigan buttons, and the position of the bones all matched his account. The scratches on her ribs, the struggle preserved in marks no one in 1974 had understood, now aligned with his reluctant admissions. The question that haunted Santos was whether Anna Mae had been his only victim. The shoebox suggested otherwise. When pressed about the other items, Hale grew silent, his gaze slipping into the distance. Keepsakes, he muttered. Mementos. He refused to elaborate. Investigators began reviewing missing persons cases from the region, cross-referencing dates with his fire logs, and searching for patterns. Though no direct connections emerged immediately, the possibility loomed that Anna Mae's death had not been an isolated crime, but part of a shadowed pattern hidden behind decades of community service. The community's reaction to his confession was disbelief and grief tangled together. Newspapers carried headlines that felt surreal. Former fire chief admits role in 1974 disappearance. People who had trusted him for years suddenly questioned every memory, every handshake, and every prayer he had led. Churches filled with uneasy silence as sermons stumbled over words like trust, betrayal, and evil in plain sight. At the diner, where he had once presided over coffee and conversation, the regulars sat in stunned quiet, cups cooling in their hands. For Margaret Collins, the confession was both an answer and a new wound. She sat in her farmhouse kitchen when Santos told her, the table between them scattered with photographs and notes. Margaret's hands trembled as she pressed a tissue to her lips. He stood right here, she whispered, her voice breaking. He drank my coffee. He told me he'd keep looking. The betrayal cut deeper than the crime itself. The knowledge that the man who had comforted her for decades had been the reason for her grief. Yet amid the devastation, there was also resolve. The case file no longer bore the weight of endless questions. It had a name, a voice, and an admission. Justice, however belated, was now within reach. The county prepared for trial, the courtroom poised to host the confrontation between decades of silence and the truth that had finally forced its way into the light. The courthouse in Laurel County had seen its share of trials, but nothing like this. By the time Robert Hale's arraignment date arrived in early autumn of 2019, the building was encircled with news vans, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, lenses trained on the front doors. Inside, the wooden pews of the courtroom filled quickly with retired farmers in denim jackets, former students, now grandparents, church elders, and curious teenagers who had grown up hearing whispers of Anna Mae Collins, but never expecting to see the mystery resolved in their lifetime. The air carried the charge of reckoning, of a community staring into a mirror and not liking the reflection. Hale was led in through the side door, shackled, wearing an orange jumpsuit that made his once commanding posture appear diminished. His hair, silver and thin, reflected the overhead lights. Some gasped quietly when they saw him. Others shook their heads in disbelief. For nearly 50 years, he had been their protector, the man they trusted to answer fire alarms and keep watch over barns. Now he was the accused, the mask stripped away by soil, science, and the persistence of time. The prosecution laid out its case with methodical precision. Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Cole began with the discovery: the pale blue cardigan unearthed by construction, the bracelet engraved with initials, and the skeletal remains confirmed by dental records. She walked the jury through photographs of the excavation, each image displayed on a screen with somber clarity. Then came the forensic evidence: DNA beneath Anna Mae's fingernails, preserved in clay, matched beyond any statistical doubt to Hale. Cole's voice was calm but firm. This is not conjecture. This is not coincidence. This is the truth the ground itself has preserved. Witnesses were called one by one. Dr. Emily Chen described the excavation in clinical but respectful terms, her voice steady as she explained the fractures to the hyoid bone. Forensic analyst Jennifer Walsh testified about the DNA extraction, breaking down the science so that jurors could understand the impossibility of error. The probability of this profile belonging to anyone other than Robert Hale, she said, is less than 1 in several trillion. Then came the testimony that tore through the courtroom like a raw wind. Margaret Collins herself. At 81, her frame was slight, her steps were slow, but her presence was unshakable. She carried with her the photograph she had shown Santos the day the remains were found. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades. He drank coffee at my table. He prayed with me. He promised me he would not stop searching for my Anna Mae. And all the while, he knew exactly where she was. Her words cracked only once, when she lifted the photograph for the jury to see. This is my daughter, 16 years old. He took her from us, and then he let me believe he was my friend. The defense attorney, a weary man assigned by the court, attempted to sow doubt. He argued contamination of evidence, mislabeling, and the unreliability of memory after decades. He pointed to Hale's service record, his years of volunteerism, and the absence of any criminal record. But each attempt was dismantled by the prosecution's precision. Every time the defense suggested contamination, the prosecution countered with chain of custody records. Every time they invoked Hale's reputation, the prosecution returned to the DNA, unyielding and absolute. Detective Santos testified as well, guiding the jury through the investigation's path, from cold case file to modern forensic breakthrough. She described the shoebox of trinkets found in Hale's attic, pausing to hold up Anna Mae's photograph recovered from his belongings. This picture was never given to him. He kept it hidden for 45 years. The jurors leaned forward, the weight of silence filling the room after her words. When Hale himself took the stand against his attorney's advice, it was not a confession but a plea for legacy. He spoke of decades of service, of barns saved, of families he claimed to have protected. But under cross-examination, his words faltered. When asked directly why his DNA was beneath Anna Mae's fingernails, he hesitated. His hands trembled, His voice cracked. "She fought," he muttered, echoing the words he had let slip during interrogation. The courtroom stilled. For many, that was the moment the facade finally crumbled. The trial stretched for weeks, each day peeling back another layer of a man who had lived behind a mask. Testimony from townspeople illustrated his duality. The fire chief who arrived at midnight to help, the neighbor who lingered too long near teenage girls, and the man who never missed a funeral, but whose eyes sometimes seemed too fixed, too intent. It was a portrait of someone hiding in plain sight, weaponizing trust as effectively as any tool. Closing arguments arrived in November. Ada Cole stood before the jury, her voice measured but fierce. This community placed its faith in Robert Hale. He used that faith as a shield, a mask, and a weapon. But Anna Mae Collins fought back. She fought so hard she left his skin beneath her nails. And today, decades later, her fight still speaks. Listen to her. The defense repeated its refrain of doubt, contamination, and age, but the words felt hollow against the mountain of evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. When they returned, the courtroom hushed to a silence so complete that even the hum of fluorescent lights seemed loud. "We find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder." The words cut through 45 years of uncertainty like a blade through fog. Margaret Collins closed her eyes, tears running freely down her cheeks. In that moment, grief and relief collided, an answer finally given, though it came wrapped in sorrow. Hale sat unmoving, his expression slack, as the verdict was read. For the first time, perhaps, he looked small. The authority that had cloaked him for decades was gone. He was just a man, and now, a convicted man. Sentencing came 6 weeks after the verdict, on a cold January morning when frost glazed the courthouse steps and breath hung white in the air. The crowd that gathered outside seemed larger than before. Neighbors, former students, and distant relatives who had driven in from surrounding counties to witness what many considered the final chapter in a story that had haunted their lives. Inside, the courtroom was filled with the same pews and faces, but the atmosphere had shifted. The verdict had broken something, stripped away denial. Now came the reckoning. Robert Hale was led in by deputies, shackled, an orange jumpsuit replacing the uniform of authority he had worn for decades. His face had sagged in the weeks since conviction, the lines deeper, the eyes dimmer. Yet he still carried himself with the posture of a man who had once been obeyed. He glanced once at the gallery, where Margaret Collins sat in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the photograph of Anna Mae resting atop her cane. Hale's gaze lingered, then fell to the floor. Judge Evelyn Marks presided, her robe a stark black contrast to the pale wood around her. She spoke of the gravity of crimes that echo through generations, of trust betrayed and innocence stolen. "This court acknowledges that no sentence can restore what was taken," she said, her voice carrying through the chamber. "But the law demands accountability. Even after nearly half a century, the prosecution recommended life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, emphasizing the premeditation in Hale's burial of Anna Mae, the manipulation of community trust, and the cruelty of allowing her family to live in uncertainty for 45 years. The defense argued for leniency on account of Hale's age and declining health, suggesting he posed no further danger. But their words fell flat. The jury's verdict had already shattered any illusion of benevolence. Before sentencing, the court heard victim impact statements. Margaret Collins rose slowly, supported by her nephew, and walked to the stand. The room held its breath as she spoke. Her voice was soft but unyielding. "For 45 years, I searched for answers. For 45 years, I sat at my kitchen table, across from the man who pretended to search with me. He prayed with me. He promised me hope. All the while, he knew where my daughter lay. He let me bury my husband without answers. He let me grow old without the sound of her laughter." Her hands trembled as she lifted Anna Mae's photograph. "This is my child. He cannot take any more from me, but he must answer for what he has done." Others followed. A cousin, who had grown up with Anna Mae, recalled summers spent picking blackberries and laughing by the creek. A teacher spoke of her promise as a student and how she might have become anything. A nurse, writer, and teacher herself. Each voice layered grief upon grief, painting the picture of a life cut short and the ripples that never ceased. When the judge finally pronounced the sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, the room exhaled as though it had been holding its breath for decades. The sound was not of triumph, but of weary relief, like the closing of a long-buried wound that would always ache but could now begin to scar. Hale showed no visible reaction. He stood, shackled, and was led away. The door closed behind him, its thud echoing through the chamber like the final period on a sentence too long in the making. Outside, reporters clustered around Margaret Collins as she emerged into the cold air. She wore her black coat, her cane steady in her hand. Her words were brief but resonant. The ground spoke. The truth was heard. "My Anna Mae can rest." Behind her, townspeople whispered, some still stunned, others expressing quiet anger at their own blindness. "He fixed my roof," one man muttered. And all along, his voice trailed off, unable to complete the thought. The community entered a season of reckoning. Churches held vigils not for Hale, but for the trust he had corrupted. Sermons grappled with evil in ordinary clothes, with the danger of blind faith in appearances. At the diner, conversations circled endlessly, people revisiting old memories, searching for signs they might have missed: the lingering gaze, the late-night drives, and the way Hale had inserted himself into every crisis. The realization that he had hidden in plain sight unsettled them more than the crime itself. For the sheriff's department, the case became a watershed moment. Younger deputies studied the files, learning how fragile investigations could be when trust overshadowed suspicion. The use of genetic genealogy was hailed as revolutionary, a reminder that time no longer protected the guilty as it once had. Training programs across Kentucky began incorporating the Collins case into their curriculum, teaching recruits that science and persistence could reach where intuition and manpower once failed. Margaret returned to her farmhouse, where Anna Mae's bedroom had remained untouched since 1974. On the bedspread lay the photograph she had carried through court, edges softened from years of handling. She sat in the doorway for a long time, the silence heavy but no longer infinite. Closure was an imperfect word, but it was something. For the first time in decades, she allowed herself to speak her daughter's name without the sting of unanswered questions. The verdict did not erase the decades of absence, but it changed the air in Laurel County. For the first time since 1974, Anna Mae Collins's name was no longer synonymous with mystery. It was linked to truth, to the possibility that even silence could be broken. The town, so long accustomed to whispering her story in fragments, began to speak it plainly. Church bulletins carried her photograph on their covers. The high school, where she had once walked the halls, held a memorial assembly, students standing in respectful silence as teachers recounted the bright, bookish girl whose life had been stolen before most of their parents were even born. At the edge of County Road 17, where her books had been found scattered in the fog all those years ago, neighbors built a modest memorial. A wooden cross, painted white, rose from the ditch, surrounded by wildflowers planted by volunteers. Someone added a plaque engraved with her name and the dates, 1958 and 1974. People began to leave tokens, fresh flowers, handwritten notes, and even school ribbons tied to the fence posts. For years, that stretch of road had carried a ghostly reputation. Now, it became a place of quiet pilgrimage, where the community could acknowledge both its grief and its resilience. The Collins farmhouse, though weathered and worn, became a gathering point. Reporters sought Margaret's perspective, but she offered her words sparingly. "I want people to remember her laughter," she said once, her eyes resting on the framed graduation announcement that had never been used. Not just the way she was taken. She declined interviews that sought sensational detail, choosing instead to speak about perseverance, about the way love can outlast despair. Detective Santos, too, became a figure of quiet admiration. She had not been alive when Anna Mae disappeared, yet her work bridged the decades, honoring both the tenacity of Sergeant Warren and the steadfast faith of Margaret Collins. At conferences, she spoke about the case, her tone always reverent. "We think time is the enemy in cold cases," she told one audience, "but time can also be an ally. Evidence preserved becomes sharper when science catches up. The ground held its secret until we had the tools to hear it." National attention followed. News outlets reported on the case as an emblem of how forensic genealogy was rewriting justice. Across the country, other families called their local departments, urging them to test the old evidence boxes in their basements. The name Anna Mae Collins appeared in articles about breakthroughs in Nevada, Oregon, and Pennsylvania. Her story was no longer just local. It became part of a national chorus, insisting that the past was not beyond reach. Within the county, however, the reckoning was more intimate. Neighbors gathered in kitchens and church halls, grappling with the betrayal of Robert Hale. They remembered his firm handshake, his lantern in the fields, and his voice leading prayers. Some admitted to guilt for never having questioned his presence, for accepting his role without suspicion. "He was one of us," an elderly man said at the diner, staring into his coffee. "That's why it worked. That's how he hid." The recognition was painful, but necessary. The town understood now that trust must be paired with vigilance. Margaret received letters from strangers' mothers in distant states, teenagers who had read about Anna Mae online, and other families of the missing. Some thanked her for her persistence. Others shared their own unresolved grief. She answered many of them by hand, her cursive careful, her words simple. Never stop speaking their name. Never stop asking. Her farmhouse mailbox, once a source of dread for its official letters of disappointment, became a conduit of solidarity. The local high school established a scholarship in Anna Mae's name, awarded each year to a student pursuing studies in criminal justice or forensic science. At the first ceremony, Margaret stood beside Detective Santos as the recipient. A young woman with ambitions to become a forensic analyst accepted the award. Cameras flashed, but the moment felt less about publicity and more about continuity, a promise that Anna Mae's story would ripple forward as a catalyst for justice in other lives. Even in the small rituals of daily life, her absence was acknowledged differently. Each September, on the anniversary of her disappearance, church bells rang at dusk. The sound carried across fields and farmhouses, a reminder of both loss and endurance. Families lit candles in their windows. Teenagers who had once treated County Road 17 as a place of dares now approached it with reverence, pausing at the memorial to leave notes scrawled on notebook paper. "We remember you," one read. For the sheriff's department, the case became a training tool, not just for the science, but for the humanity. Recruits were told the story not as a boast of eventual success, but as a cautionary tale of how assumptions can blind investigators, how predators can exploit trust, and how communities must learn to question even the most respected. Sergeant Warren's old notes were digitized, and his insistence on "await science" was preserved as a mantra. Though he had not lived to see the resolution, his work had carried the flame that Santos finally used to light the truth. By the close of 2020, life in Laurel County carried on. Fields are still plowed, church bells are still rung, and diners are still filled with talk of crops and weather. Yet beneath it all was a subtle shift, a collective awareness that time does not erase, that secrets do not rot in the ground if people remain willing to listen. Anna Mae's story had become part of the soil itself, woven into the identity of a place that had once been nearly forgotten and now could not forget. Winter receded slowly in Laurel County, the frost pulling back from fence posts and fields, the soil softening again as if to exhale after years of holding its secret. At the Collins farmhouse, the red barn still stood, paint faded, roof patched, but stubborn against the passing decades. Margaret Collins often sat on the porch in her rocking chair, wrapped in a quilt, gazing at the land that had defined her life. For so long she had lived beneath the shadow of a question. Now, though the answer carried its own cruelty, it had been spoken. The silence was gone. Anna Mae's story had become more than one family's grief. It was a reminder etched into the heart of a community that evil can wear a trusted face, that time does not bury truth if there is persistence, and that even decades later, justice can rise from the ground like a seed finally breaking the surface. Her life, cut short at 16, continued in the scholarship bearing her name, in the training programs for young detectives, and in the church bells that tolled each September at dusk. The irony was not lost on those who reflected. Robert Hale had lived freely for 45 years, respected, praised, and even trusted with prayers. But the very soil he counted on to conceal his crime preserved the evidence that convicted him. The cardigan, the bracelet, and the DNA under her fingernails. Small fragments that survived storms, plows, and time itself spoke louder than his reputation ever could. Anna Mae had fought back, and in the end, her fight carried across generations. For the people of Laurel County, the resolution brought no celebration, only the sober acknowledgement that truth, however delayed, is essential. Conversations at the diner shifted toward vigilance, toward teaching their children not just to trust, but to question. Teachers spoke Anna Mae's name in classrooms, not as a ghost story, but as a lesson in resilience and community accountability. Her memorial on County Road 17, once a lonely marker, now received steady visitors' bouquets in spring, candles in autumn, and snow-dusted wreaths in winter. She was no longer missing. She was remembered. Margaret Collins lived to see the trial, the sentencing, and the recognition of her daughter's struggle. She carried herself with quiet strength, telling those who asked that persistence was not a choice but a duty. "If I stopped speaking her name," she once told a reporter, "then who would?" Her words traveled beyond the county line, touching families who still waited for answers in their own cold cases. For them, the Collins case was not just a story but a promise that silence is not the end, that buried evidence can bloom into truth. As the years moved on, Anna Mae's name remained carved into the identity of the place she called home, not just as a tragedy, but as a symbol of the persistence required to drag truth out of silence. Her laughter, described so often by her friends, became the note that people remembered most, not the fog, not the fear, but the light she carried. And so, the story closes not with triumph, but with reflection. Justice had come, imperfect and delayed, but undeniable. The soil of Kentucky had kept its secret until the world was ready to listen. And when it spoke with clarity, carrying Anna Mae's fight forward across time. If you've followed this case, you've seen how the combination of persistence, science, and the determination of one grieving mother finally cracked a silence that had lasted nearly half a century. These stories remind us that truth can be delayed, but it cannot be erased. If you want to continue exploring the mysteries and cold cases that shape communities and test the limits of justice, make sure you're subscribed. Your support allows these stories to keep reaching those who need to hear them. And together, we'll continue to bring the past into the light.